He writes this: "Perhaps what we modern people need most is to be genuinely shaken, so that where life is grounded, we would feel its stability, and where life is unstable and uncertain, immoral and unprincipled, we would know that also, and we would endure it." Perhaps, he writes, that is the ultimate answer to the question of why God has sent us into this time, why he permits this whirlwind to go over the whole earth, and why he holds us in a state of chaos and in hopelessness and in darkness, and why there is no end in sight. It is because, he writes, we have stood here on the earth with a totally false and inauthentic sense of security. So now God lets the earth resound, and now he shudders it, and then he shakes it, not to call forth a false anxiety. He does it to teach us one thing: how to be moved in the Spirit. Those are the words of the Jesuit priest Aflred Delp. He's been my go-to author this Advent. I've been reading him a lot. I've been thinking about him a lot, reading his homilies and his sermons and his meditations. The time of being genuinely shaken by the whirlwind, hopelessness, chaos. He's not certainly talking about the current time of pandemic and political divisions. Aflred Delp wrote these words in Advent of 1941, almost 80 years ago. As a Jesuit priest in Germany, he witnessed the horrific rise of Adolf Hitler and the cruelty of the Nazi regime. Like other members of his religious order, Delp spoke out against this darkness. They did it in publications that were frequently shut down, if not permanently shut down. They did it in meetings and in various ways in which they tried to get out the word about the goodness of people, helping them to be moved in spirit. In July of 1944, there was a failed assassination attempt on the life of Hitler. And so all the members of the resistance were arrested, even when it was clear, as in Delp's case, that they had nothing to do with this assassination attempt. So Delp was transferred to a prison in Berlin. And while he was in prison, he would secretly say Mass. He wrote letters, reflections on Advent and Christmas, and other spiritual subjects which were smuggled out of prison before he went to trial. He was a Jesuit priest, but he was waiting to make his final vows as a Jesuit, a member of the Society of Jesus. And so on December the 8th, 1944, some 76 years ago, Delp had a visit from one of the members of his religious community, from one of the Jesuits. And in that moment in his cell, he professed his final vows as a Jesuit. Now, this was completely forbidden to do, but the attending guard had no idea of what was going on when the two men were speaking. And, it's very touching to me to think that Aflred Delp, after years of studying and preparing and doing all kinds of ministry to live a life as a Jesuit, the moment when he makes his final vows, a thrilling moment, is done in the most difficult of circumstances. Now, this picture of Delp is taken at his trial. And at one point, the Nazis, the Gestapo in particular, said they would drop the charges against Delp if he would publicly denounce, disavow the Jesuit community and leave them. He refused, and on the Feast of the Presentation, February the 2nd, 1945, he was hung in prison. What Delp learned in that chaotic whirlwind that he found himself in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, what he learned was how to be moved in spirit, how the grace of God would strengthen him, console him, embolden him, and keep his spirit firm when the world around him seemed to be falling apart, when everything that he thought was certain was seeming to slip away and was shaken. That is what Jesus is getting at in the very unusual, we might even say odd parable he tells in today's gospel at today's Mass. The parable actually is a critique that Jesus is giving of people who are half-hearted, who are not moved in the Spirit, but just are going through the motions. And so he says some people looked at John the Baptist, they said, oh, he's too serious and he's very ascetic and he's too extreme. We can't follow him. And then Jesus says others look at him, Jesus, and say, oh, he's hanging around with sinners. He's eating and drinking with people, and so he's not serious. We can't follow him either. Jesus uses this parable to say that there will always be people who will give some excuse as to why they can't change their lives, some critique of other people without looking deeply into their own lives. That's what Advent is about. It's about looking deeply in our own life and seeing how we are being moved in spirit. And I think that's why Delp's words speak to me so much this Advent, that God is teaching us something. Where over the past months have you experienced God's grace moving you in some way, strengthening you, emboldening you, consoling you, keeping your life firm? It's been hard, hasn't it? But if a falsely accused man could find it in a very small prison cell, I know that we can find it, that we have found it in our own time. So we're about halfway through Advent. What's on your list of things that you still have to do? Usually, in most years, that list at this point could be pretty long, but I suspect for many of us, our Christmas preparation lists have shortened. Advent has been very different. Christmas will not be the same as usual. But maybe for the first time, what I'm thinking about today is that for the first time, maybe in a long time, or the first time ever, we will actually embrace the meaning of Advent and Christmas in a way that does not have all the usual distractions to keep us from doing that. Christmas is coming in a time of darkness, a time of life being unsettled. Advent 2020 tells us that Christmas coming that way this year, it is a gift, for it will strengthen us not only in the present challenges, but I think it's going to help us to find all the signs of hope up ahead when we turn into the year 2021. I have found Aflred Delp's words challenging. I found them very intense, but very helpful to me in thinking about my spirit and what I've allowed my spirit to be moved toward and moved from. I found these other words of him that I've been praying about over these last days, particularly on the anniversary of his final vows in prison. May his words about Advent be a source of meditation and prayer and renewal for you. He writes, "We must not shy away from Advent. We must let our inner eye see and our hearts range far. Then we will encounter both the seriousness of Advent and its blessings in a different way. We will, if we would but listen, hear the message calling out to us to cheer us, to console us, and to uplift us."